Have you ever noticed that your life does not usually stop because you are incapable, but because some quieter part of you keeps hesitating, keeps doubting, keeps asking for one more sign before it fully commits? That is how many people lose years. Not because they had no potential, but because they kept obeying the version of themselves shaped by fear, old embarrassment, and repeated self-doubt. They wait to feel ready, and because they wait, they never create the proof that could have changed how they see themselves. So this episode is not about temporary motivation or one intense emotional moment. It is about something deeper and more demanding, training yourself to believe in yourself strongly enough that you stop shrinking, stop asking for permission, and stop letting the older, weaker story keep deciding how far you go. Because self-belief cannot stay a feeling. It has to become a discipline. And that begins with the first thing you must break: the story that keeps you small. 1. Break the story that keeps you small. Most limits do not begin as facts. They begin as stories you heard often enough, repeated often enough, and obeyed long enough that they stopped sounding like interpretations and started sounding like identity. Maybe the story was built from one embarrassment that stayed alive in your memory far longer than it should have. Maybe it came from criticism you received when you were too young to question it properly. Maybe it grew out of failure, rejection, comparison, or years of watching yourself hesitate until hesitation began to feel natural. However it started, the real danger is not that the story appeared. The real danger is that you kept returning to it until it became the lens through which you read your whole life. That is how people become smaller than they really are, without fully understanding why. They stop trying certain things because the story says it will end badly. They speak with less force because the story says they are not that kind of person. They downplay their ambition, soften their presence, and lower their own expectations before life even has the chance to answer them. Then, because they are acting from that smaller place, they create weaker results, and those weaker results are used as proof that the story was right all along. This is what makes old self-doubt so convincing. It does not only live in the mind, it starts shaping behavior, and then behavior comes back wearing the mask of evidence. The truth is that many of the things you believe about yourself were decided too early. A few painful moments became permanent conclusions. A temporary version of you became a fixed definition. You failed once, so the story became, "I always ruin things." You froze once, so the story became, "I am not confident." You were judged once, so the story became, "People will always see me this way." None of these are solid truths. They are exaggerated meanings built from repeated emotional memory, and the longer you keep treating them as your real self, the harder it becomes to step into any stronger version of your life, because every attempt at growth immediately feels fake, unnatural, or unsafe. This is why you cannot become stronger while still protecting the narrative that keeps you weak. At some point, you have to stop treating the old story like sacred truth and start seeing it for what it really is. A mental structure that may have once explained your pain, but no longer deserves to decide your future. That does not mean denying what happened to you. It means refusing to let what happened become the final authority on who you're allowed to become. And this is where the work gets uncomfortable, because the story that keeps you small usually feels familiar enough to seem honest. It may even feel humble. It may sound like realism, caution, self-awareness, or just knowing yourself. But there is a major difference between knowing your patterns and surrendering to them. Real self-knowledge says, "I see where I tend to shrink." False self-knowledge says, That is simply who I am. The first creates room for change. The second seals the door before the work even begins. So the first shift is not external, it is internal and ruthless. You begin listening for the old sentences with new suspicion. I am not ready. I am not built for this. People like me do not do this well. I always lose momentum. I do better when I stay small. It is safer not to expect too much. You stop calling these truths just because they arrive in your own voice. You start recognizing them as rehearsed lines from an identity that has already cost you too much. That recognition matters because once the story is exposed as a story, you can begin refusing it in real time, not with fake positivity, not by pretending you already feel powerful, but by no longer letting the old script narrate every decision. You catch it when it appears. You name it. You see how it tries to shrink your next move. And then, instead of arguing endlessly with it, you act in a way that quietly contradicts it. That is how the old story loses power, not because you finally destroy it in one dramatic moment, but because you stop feeding it with behavior. The story says, stay back, and you step forward anyway. The story says, say less, and you speak clearly anyway. The story says, you are not ready, and you begin before comfort arrives. Every time you do that, you weaken the authority of the old self and strengthen the reality of the new one. Because belief does not become real when you feel different first. It becomes real when you stop protecting the version of yourself that was built around fear. The smaller story only survives as long as you keep living like it deserves loyalty. The moment you stop defending it, the moment you stop repeating it, the moment you stop arranging your life around its warnings, it begins to starve. And that is where self-belief actually begins. Not in one big speech, not in one emotional breakthrough, but in the decision to stop letting old conditioning introduce you to yourself. Once that happens, the next step becomes much clearer, because after you break the story that keeps you small, you have to build something stronger in its place. 2. Train confidence like a skill. A lot of people talk about confidence as if it was some invisible gift that either appeared early in your life or never did, as if certain people were simply born knowing how to walk into rooms, speak clearly, handle pressure, and trust themselves under friction, while others were left trying to imitate a quality they were never really given. But confidence does not work that way. What you call confidence is very often the result of repetition. It's built the same way weakness is built, through practice, through response, through the kind of inner and outer behavior you keep rehearsing until it begins to feel natural. That is why confidence grows in people who stop waiting to feel confident first. They stop treating it like an emotion and start treating it like a skill. A skill means something important. It can be trained badly, or it can be trained well. It can become stronger or weaker depending on what you repeat. And most people, without meaning to, spend years training the opposite of confidence. They rehearse hesitation. They rehearse apology. They rehearse over-explaining. They rehearse imagining failure before they begin. They rehearse backing down the moment discomfort appears. Then they wonder why confidence does not arrive. But why would it? The mind and body have been practicing retreat. This is why you need to become much more honest about what you are rehearsing every day. Because every time you speak more quietly than you needed to, every time you abandon your own point too early, every time you treat uncertainty like danger, every time you make yourself smaller to avoid friction, you are not just having a moment. You are training a pattern. And patterns always get easier with repetition. That is true for self-doubt. And it is also true for strength. Real confidence is not built in fantasy. It is built in correction. You do something awkwardly, then do it again, with more steadiness. You speak while your voice still shakes a little, then you speak again. You make a decision without perfect certainty, then you live through the discomfort of not having total reassurance, and your system learns something important. I can survive this. I can handle this. I do not collapse every time I move before I feel completely safe. That is what confidence actually grows from. Not the absence of tension, but repeated proof that tension does not own you. This is why confidence often looks quieter than people imagine. It is not always loud, charismatic, or dramatic. Sometimes it is just a person who has repeated self-command enough times that they no longer panic at every moment of exposure. They have built enough internal evidence to stop negotiating with themselves so much. They do not need to inflate themselves. They do not need to announce strength. They have practiced it too often for it to feel foreign. And that should give you hope, because it means confidence is not reserved for some ideal future version of you. It can begin now, inside much smaller moments than your fear wants you to believe. You do not have to wait for a major life transformation. You can start training confidence in one conversation, one decision, one boundary, one piece of work finished instead of delayed, one honest act done without asking for permission first. That is how it becomes believable, because the mind does not trust declarations for long. It trusts repeated experience. You can tell yourself you are strong 100 times, but if your habits keep rehearsing avoidance, your body will believe the habits before it believes the words. On the other hand, if your words are still catching up, but your actions are beginning to change, belief starts forming from underneath. Slowly, quietly, structurally. You stop saying, "I hope I can," and begin noticing, "I have done difficult things before, and I can do the next one too." That shift is not magic, it is training. And part of that training means being willing to look unimpressive at first. This is where many people sabotage themselves. They do not mind becoming stronger in theory, but they hate the phase where strength still looks uncertain. They want confidence without the shaky beginning. They want the finished energy without the early discomfort. But every skill has an awkward stage, and confidence is no exception. If you refuse that stage, you refuse the very practice that could have changed you. So the question stops being, "Do I feel confident today?" and becomes, "What would a stronger version of me practice today?" That question is better because it puts the focus back on rehearsal instead of mood. It asks for behavior, not fantasy. It tells you where to place your effort. Maybe today confidence looks like finishing what you started. Maybe it looks like saying less and meaning it more. Maybe it looks like making one clean decision and not reopening it 10 times. Maybe it looks like tolerating the discomfort of being seen trying. Maybe it looks like acting before your fear finishes its speech. Whatever form it takes, the principle stays the same. What you rehearse consistently becomes easier to believe. And this is where something powerful begins to happen. The more often you think, act and respond from strength, the less foreign strength feels. The less foreign it feels, the less performance it requires. The less performance it requires, the more stable it becomes. And once confidence becomes stable, it stops being something you chase in moments of insecurity and starts becoming the way you move through life when pressure shows up. That is why training confidence matters so much. Not because confidence itself is the final goal, but because without it, you keep underusing your own life. You keep letting fear act as if it were wisdom. You keep waiting for a feeling that only action could have created. So do not ask whether confidence has arrived. Ask what you are practicing, Because if you keep rehearsing retreat, retreat will feel natural. But if you keep rehearsing steadiness, courage, follow-through and exposure, strength will begin to feel more and more like home. And once confidence becomes something you train instead of something you wait for, the next shift becomes possible, because the mind starts seeing a different kind of world. 3. Train your mind to see possibility, not weakness. There is a quiet way the mind can betray you before life even has the chance to, and it happens when your attention has been trained for so long to notice what is missing, risky, embarrassing, or likely to fail, that it walks into every new moment already looking for evidence that you should stay small. You see an opening, but your mind sees the chance of rejection. You feel the pull to begin, but your mind shows you the version where you lose momentum and prove all your old doubts right. You sense that your life could expand, but the first thing your inner world offers you is not movement. It is caution, doubt, and a familiar list of reasons why this may not be for you. That is not wisdom. That is conditioning, because the mind is always searching for proof of what it already expects. If it expects weakness, it will keep finding weakness. If it expects danger, it will keep exaggerating risk. If it expects failure, it will notice every obstacle and ignore every opening. Then, after filtering reality through that lens, it will say, "See, I was right to hesitate, but it was never neutral. It was looking for confirmation from the beginning." This is why so many people think the world is closing on them, when in truth their own attention has been narrowed by fear. They are not seeing life as it is. They are seeing life through an identity that has already decided what is possible for them. And when that happens, even good opportunities start feeling suspicious. Even progress feels temporary. Even change feels unnatural. Not because life is empty of possibility, but because the mind has become more loyal to protection than to growth. A stronger life begins when you train your attention to notice more than threat. That does not mean becoming naive. It does not mean pretending that obstacles are not real. It means refusing to let weakness be the only thing your mind is good at seeing. It means asking a different question when life presents something difficult or uncertain. Not only what could go wrong, but also what could open here if I stopped assuming I was too small for it. Not only what if I fail, but also what if this is the moment where I finally stop repeating the old version of myself. That shift matters because your filter shapes your life before your circumstances fully do. A mind trained to see only danger will hesitate itself into a smaller future. A mind trained to also see possibility will move differently. It will still feel fear, but it will not worship it. It will still notice difficulty, but it will not confuse difficulty with impossibility. It will still respect risk, but it will not let risk speak louder than potential. And this is where the work becomes practical. You start watching what your mind highlights first. When an opportunity appears, what does it immediately show you? The cost or the opening? When you make a mistake, does it show you humiliation or adjustment? When you think about the future, does it show you collapse or room to become more than you have been? These first highlights matter because repeated attention becomes belief, and belief starts directing behavior. Maybe the world does not change first. Maybe your filter does. Maybe the reason life has felt closed is not because every door was locked, but because your attention kept walking past the doors that required courage, effort, and a different self-concept to open. That is why this point is so important. The mind you carry determines what kind of life you can even recognize. So begin retraining it. When the old lens rushes to weakness, widen it. When it says, "I can't," ask, "Is that true?" Or just familiar. When it rushes to embarrassment, ask what growth it is trying to protect you from. When it wants to stare only at threat, deliberately bring your attention back to possibility, not as fantasy, but as balance. Because life is rarely made only of risk. The fearful mind just edits out the rest. And once you do that often enough, you stop living like someone waiting to be defeated by the next hard thing. You begin moving like someone who understands that possibility is not something the world hands to a lucky few. It is something the mind must learn to recognize before the life can fully follow it. That is when belief starts getting stronger, not because life suddenly becomes easier, but because your vision of yourself inside it stops being so small. And once that happens, the next truth becomes unavoidable, because if you keep waiting for total certainty before you move, you may stay trapped in preparation forever. 4. Stop waiting for proof. Before you begin. One of the most expensive habits you can carry is the habit of demanding proof before movement, because it sounds careful, mature, and responsible on the surface, but underneath it is often just fear trying to delay exposure. You tell yourself you need more certainty, more confidence, more clarity, more signs that this will work, when what you really want is protection from the discomfort of beginning before your emotions are ready to support you. And that is how years disappear. Not in dramatic failure, but in preparation that never fully becomes life. This is why so many people stay trapped in the idea of the person they could become. They keep waiting for belief to arrive first, as if self-trust should appear before the action that creates it. But belief rarely works that way. In real life, action is often what creates the evidence belief needs. You move, then you discover you can carry more than you thought. You speak, then you realize your voice can hold. You start, then you notice that the thing you feared most was not the task itself, but the moment before the task, when your mind was still trying to scare you out of it. Waiting feels safe because it keeps your self-image protected. As long as you have not really begun, you can still imagine that you might be great at it later. You can still preserve potential without testing it. But that protection has a brutal cost. It keeps your life theoretical. It keeps strength unpracticed. It keeps the future dependent on moods that were never going to become stable on their own. And the truth is, readiness is often a result, not a requirement. You feel more ready after 5 honest reps than after 50 anxious fantasies. You feel more capable after 1 real attempt than after months of rehearsing how it might go. The mind keeps asking for certainty because certainty would remove risk, but the only way confidence grows is by staying in contact with risk long enough to discover that discomfort is survivable and that imperfect action is still stronger than elegant delay. That is why waiting can become its own identity. You become the person who is always almost there, always improving privately, always thinking deeply, always getting ready to make the move, but never quite stepping into the version of life that would force the old story to die. And once that identity hardens, hesitation starts feeling wise, caution starts feeling intelligent, delay starts feeling like self-respect. But if the result is the same small life repeated again, then whatever name you give it, it is still keeping you still. The shift begins when you stop asking, "Do I have enough proof to begin?" and start asking, "What proof could only be created if I begin now?" That question changes the direction completely. It moves the mind out of fantasy and into contact with reality. It reminds you that many things cannot be solved by thinking harder. They can only be built through contact, through repetition, through trying while not fully ready. and discovering that readiness grows on the other side of movement. This is true in almost every part of life. You do not gain social confidence by thinking about speaking more. You gain it by speaking more. You do not build discipline by waiting for the perfect morning. You build it by getting up and doing the first thing anyway. You do not become someone who trusts themselves by making beautiful promises in private. You become that person when your body starts learning that your actions no longer depend entirely on your comfort. That is what self-belief needs most. Evidence. Not imagined evidence, lived evidence. The kind you can only collect by moving before the mind gives you full emotional permission. That is why so many strong people are not fearless. They are simply less obedient to the part of themselves that always wants another guarantee. So if you have been waiting for proof, understand what that really means. You have been waiting for the future to reward you for work you have not yet fully entered. Life does not move that way. The path does not reveal its strength to the person standing still at the entrance studying it. It reveals itself to the one who takes the first step and keeps going long enough for the fear to stop being the loudest thing in the room. You do not need to begin boldly. You do not need to begin perfectly. You do not even need to begin with strong emotions. You only need to stop making comfort the price of entry. Because once movement begins before comfort does, something important happens inside you. The old self loses one of its favorite weapons. It can still talk, still warn, still hesitate, but it can no longer claim that nothing is possible until you feel different first. You will have already disproved that lie with your own life. And that is where belief starts changing shape. It stops being a mood you wait for and becomes evidence you are building, which is exactly why the next step matters so much, because once you stop waiting to begin, you have to make sure you are not living from motivation alone, but from something much stronger. 5. Upgrade your identity, not just your motivation. Motivation feels powerful because it gives you emotional energy quickly, and when that energy is there, everything seems possible. You make plans faster, speak more boldly, imagine a different future with unusual clarity, and for a brief moment, it feels as if change has already begun. But motivation has one weakness that ruins a lot of lives. It does not stay. It rises, then drops. It burns bright, then disappears. And if your growth depends on that emotional rise, then your life will keep moving in bursts instead of in structure. That is why motivation alone cannot carry transformation. It can start a fire, but it cannot build a foundation. A person who keeps relying on motivation will always feel divided because part of them wants change, but the deeper part still lives under an older identity. And identity always wins over temporary emotion. You can feel inspired at night and still wake up in the morning acting like the same person if the story you carry about yourself has not changed. This is where many people get stuck without realizing it. They try to improve their habits without changing the self they keep rehearsing. They want discipline, but still think of themselves as inconsistent. They want confidence, but still speak inwardly like someone who expects to fail. They want a stronger life, but they keep introducing themselves to themselves through the language of the old version. Then, when motivation fades, they fall back into whatever identity already feels familiar. Because that is the truth. You act in line with who you believe you are. Not perfectly, but repeatedly. If somewhere inside you still believe you are the kind of person who quits, hides, hesitates, or needs pressure before action, then your behavior will keep circling back to match that picture. This is why real change becomes easier when identity shifts first, or at least when identity starts being rehearsed deliberately. You stop asking only, how do I stay motivated, and start asking, who am I practicing becoming every day? That question changes the whole structure of growth. Because once identity becomes the target, the work becomes more stable. You are no longer chasing feelings. You are building a self. You are teaching your mind and body to recognize a different version of you through repetition. Not performance, not pretending. Practice. There is a difference. Performance wants others to believe you have changed. Practice is how you quietly become someone who no longer needs to announce it. This is where act as if becomes useful, but only when used honestly. Not as fake confidence, not as empty posturing, and not as some theatrical version of self-help where you talk like a king while your habits still serve fear. Real identity rehearsal is simpler than that. It means asking, what would the stronger version of me do in this exact moment? Then doing that one thing, even if your emotions lag behind. It means letting action teach the nervous system what kind of person you are becoming. Maybe the stronger version of you gets up when the alarm rings instead of negotiating. Maybe that version speaks more directly. Maybe that version stops reopening decisions out of fear. Maybe that version does the work without needing applause first. Maybe that version leaves the old excuse unanswered. These are not tiny moments. They are identity votes. Each one is a signal sent inward. Each one tells the mind, we are no longer living exactly the same way. And when those signals repeat, identity begins to change from the inside. Not because you declared it, but because you practiced it until the old self stopped being the most believable one. This also explains why some people stay trapped in motivation cycles for years. They keep trying to push themselves emotionally into a better life while protecting the old identity underneath. They want better results, but they still feel loyal to the older self who stayed small, stayed cautious, stayed half-committed, stayed dependent on mood. And until that loyalty is broken, the same collapse will keep repeating after every temporary high. So do not ask motivation to do the work of identity. It cannot. Motivation can move you for a day. Identity directs you when the day gets ordinary, when no one is watching, when the emotion is low, and when the old self starts whispering again. That is why the strongest shift often sounds quieter than people expect. You stop saying, I hope I can become this kind of person, and start saying, I am training that self now. That sentence carries responsibility. It makes your actions matter more. It removes some of the romance and replaces it with repetition. And repetition is exactly what identity respects. You do not become unstoppable by feeling powerful once. You become harder to stop when your habits begin matching the person you say you want to be. So if you want a stronger life, stop depending only on moods that rise and vanish. Start rehearsing a stronger identity in small, visible actions every day. Let your behavior introduce you to your future self before your feelings fully catch up. Because once identity starts changing, motivation becomes a bonus instead of a requirement. And that is when growth becomes far more dangerous in the best possible way. It stops being something you visit emotionally and starts becoming the way you live. And that matters, because the next thing that will try to stop you is fear. But fear looks different once you stop treating it like a stop sign and start reading it for what it often is. 6. Use fear as a signal to grow. Fear becomes dangerous when you keep treating it like a verdict instead of a message, because the moment fear speaks, most people assume it has already identified a real limit. They feel resistance, tension, exposure, uncertainty, and the mind immediately translates that discomfort into a conclusion. This is too much. This is not for me. I should wait. I should pull back. I should stay where I know how to survive. That interpretation feels wise in the moment, because fear always speaks in the language of protection, but protection is not always the same thing as truth. Sometimes fear is warning you about real danger, but very often, especially when you are trying to grow, fear is only reacting to unfamiliarity. That distinction changes everything, because once you understand that fear is not automatically a stop sign, you begin reading it differently. You stop hearing "be careful" as "go back." You stop hearing "this feels uncomfortable" as "this must be wrong." You begin noticing that some of the most important movements in life arrive wrapped in hesitation. The hard conversation, the first public attempt, the decision to finally commit. The moment you stop hiding, the moment you stop shrinking. Fear often shows up precisely where a larger life is trying to begin. That is why avoiding fear so often keeps people trapped in smaller versions of themselves. They are not always avoiding danger. Many times they are avoiding expansion. They stay inside the familiar because the familiar does not challenge their current identity, and then they call that comfort peace, when in reality it is often just stagnation without tension. Real growth feels different. It asks more of the nervous system. It exposes you to uncertainty. It removes the illusion of control. And if you have spent years treating fear like an authority, then every doorway into a stronger life will look suspicious at first. This is why courage should never be misunderstood as the absence of fear. Courage is what happens when fear stops being the final decision maker. The mind still speaks, the body still reacts. The old self still offers its familiar warnings. But something steadier begins to answer back. I know this feels uncomfortable, but discomfort does not get to define the limit of my life anymore. That is a completely different relationship with fear. And the reason it matters so much is simple. What you keep avoiding often becomes larger than it really is. The avoided conversation grows in the mind until it feels impossible. The avoided action becomes a symbol of your weakness. The avoided risk starts controlling your self-image. Avoidance always feeds the monster because the mind keeps reading retreat as proof that the fear was justified. Then, the next time the same kind of challenge appears, your fear arrives earlier and with more authority. Not because reality changed, but because you trained the pattern. The opposite is also true. Every time you move toward a fear cleanly, calmly, and without making drama out of it, you teach your system something new. You teach it that discomfort is survivable. You teach it that exposure does not equal destruction. You teach it that uncertainty can be walked through instead of worshipped. And that is how courage grows, not through speeches, not through waiting to become someone naturally fearless, but through repeated contact with what once intimidated you, until the mind stops exaggerating its power. This does not mean recklessness. It does not mean chasing every fear just to prove something. It means learning to ask a better question when fear appears. Not only, what am I afraid of, but also, what part of me might grow if I stop obeying this automatically? That question is powerful because it turns fear from a prison guard into a signal. It helps you see that fear is often pointing toward the exact places where your old identity is still in charge. Maybe fear is showing you where you still need approval. Maybe it is showing you where embarrassment still controls your choices. Maybe it is showing you where the old story is still stronger than your future. Maybe it is showing you the edge of the life you say you want, but have not yet fully entered. And that is why fear should not always be treated as an enemy. Sometimes it is a map. A map does not force you to move, but it does show you where movement matters. If the same fear keeps appearing around the same kind of action, the same kind of visibility, the same kind of responsibility, the same kind of commitment, it is telling you something. It is showing you the place where your growth is still being negotiated by an older version of you. And if you want to become harder to stop, you cannot keep letting that older version decide everything in advance. So when fear appears, slow the moment down. Do not instantly surrender to it, and do not instantly perform against it either. Just study it honestly. Is this fear protecting me from something real, or is it protecting my current identity from expansion? Is it warning me, or is it exaggerating? Is it guiding me toward wisdom, or back toward the smallest version of my life? Those questions create room, and once there is room, choice returns. Then you take the next step, not the biggest step, not the most impressive one, the next one. That is how fear loses proportion, not by being insulted or denied, but by being met with action small enough to survive and strong enough to matter. One conversation, one attempt, one boundary, one risk, one movement toward the life you keep saying you want. Because every time you do that, fear stops being the ruler and becomes what it should have been all along, information, not authority. And over time, something shifts inside you. You stop interpreting fear as proof that you are weak. You begin recognizing it as one of the places where strength is still being built. That shift is enormous. It means you no longer need to wait for fear to disappear before you move. You understand that movement is often what teaches fear its proper size, and once you stop obeying fear so completely, another chain begins to weaken too, because many people are not only afraid of failure, they are afraid of moving without approval. 7. Stop needing permission to believe in yourself. One of the quietest ways people weaken themselves is by building their self-belief on other people's reactions, because the moment your confidence starts depending on praise, reassurance, agreement, or visible approval, it stops being stable and becomes something fragile that can rise or collapse with every room you enter. Someone supports you, and you feel stronger. Someone doubts you, and suddenly your own direction starts shaking. Someone misunderstands you, and now you feel the urge to explain, justify, prove, or wait for emotional permission before you continue. That is not self-belief. That is borrowed certainty, and borrowed certainty is always expensive. This is why so many people never become fully dangerous in the best sense of that word. Not because they lack ability, but because they keep checking the crowd before they trust their own movement. They want to know if others think it is a good idea. They want to know if they are being seen correctly. They want to know if people approve of the direction before they fully step into it. And while that seems harmless at first, it creates a subtle inner dependence. You stop living from conviction and start living from response. Your life becomes shaped less by what you know is right and more by what feels socially safe. The problem is that approval is unstable by nature. The same people who praise you one day may go silent the next. The same crowd that admires strength in theory may become uncomfortable when your strength stops being easy for them to control. The same voices that encourage you while you are still small may resist you once your growth forces them to confront their own hesitation. If your confidence is tied to those reactions, it will always feel temporary. It will always need maintenance. It will always remain vulnerable to moods that were never yours to govern. That is why self-belief has to move inward, not into arrogance, not into blindness, but into a deeper kind of authority. The kind that says, I can listen, I can learn, I can be corrected, but I will not keep waiting for external permission to trust what I am building inside myself. That shift is enormous, because once your standard moves inward, You stop asking the world to certify your worth before you act on it. You stop treating praise like proof. You stop treating doubt like a verdict. You stop making other people's limitations the ceiling of your own life. This does not mean you become closed to feedback. It means feedback stops becoming the source of your identity. You can hear what is useful without surrendering your center. You can respect another person's opinion without renting your self-belief from it. You can be questioned without collapsing into explanation. That is real strength. Quiet, stable, and much harder to shake than the kind of confidence that only exists while the room is clapping. And the truth is, other people's opinions often reveal more about their own fears than about your actual value. Someone may doubt you because they have never trusted themselves. Someone may mock what you're trying to do because they abandoned the same courage in their own life years ago. Someone may call you unrealistic because they built an identity around caution and now need everyone around them to live inside the same emotional prison. If you are not careful, you will mistake their limits for your truth. That is why self-belief must become more private, not hidden in a weak way, but protected. You stop needing to announce what you are becoming in order to feel real. You stop over-explaining your direction in the hope that support will make you stronger. You stop mentally kneeling before every reaction that comes from outside you. Instead, you build in a quieter way. You keep your promises. You train your discipline. You let the evidence accumulate in your own life first. Then, confidence starts growing from something much more solid than applause. It grows from pattern, from self-respect, from proof you can feel in your own nervous system. This is also where many people finally discover the difference between wanting to be admired and wanting to be anchored. Admiration is external and unstable. Anchoring is internal and repeatable. One makes you scan faces. The other makes you return to your own standard. One asks, "Do they believe in me?" The other asks, "Am I living in a way that makes my own belief more justified today than it was yesterday?" That second question changes everything because it brings your power back into your hands. You begin to move differently when you no longer need permission. Decisions become cleaner. Speech becomes less crowded. You hesitate less, not because life gives you guarantees, but because you stop needing emotional approval before acting on what you already know. And when setbacks come, they do not erase your whole center, because your center was never built from praise in the first place. So if you want to believe in yourself more deeply, stop asking the world to sign off on the person you are trying to become. Let other people think what they think. Let them misunderstand if they must. Let some of them doubt you. Your task is not to collect enough approval to move. Your task is to become someone whose inner standard is no longer waiting for applause. Because real self-belief begins the moment your center stops living in other people's hands. And once that happens, another habit becomes easier to see for what it is. Because many people are not only seeking approval, they are also rehearsing failure in private, long before life even tests them. 8. Stop mentally training yourself to fail. You can feel this habit most clearly in the quiet moments before anything has actually happened, when nothing has gone wrong yet, and still your mind is already preparing you for embarrassment, rejection, collapse, or some private version of humiliation that exists only in rehearsal. You have not made the call yet, but part of you is already imagining the awkward silence. You have not started the project yet, but your mind is already showing you the version where you lose momentum and prove all your old doubts right. You have not walked into the room yet, but inwardly you are already bracing for being dismissed, overlooked, or exposed. And because this happens so often, many people stop noticing how destructive it really is. They think they are being realistic, when what they are actually doing is practicing defeat before life has even had the chance to answer them honestly. That is what mental failure training looks like. It does not always come in dramatic language. Sometimes it is subtle. Sometimes it sounds like preparation. Sometimes it dresses itself up as caution, emotional intelligence, or just trying not to get disappointed. But if your mind keeps rehearsing collapse more often than capability, then do not be surprised when your body starts approaching life with hesitation, tension, and self-protection instead of force. The mind believes what it practices. That is why repeated inner rehearsal matters so much. If you constantly imagine yourself freezing, failing, being judged, losing control, disappointing people, or proving your own fears correct, you are not just thinking dark thoughts in private. You are training a response. You are telling your nervous system what kind of future to expect and what kind of self to prepare for. Then, when the real moment arrives, you do not walk into it fresh. You walk into it already carrying emotional fatigue from a battle that never even happened. This is one of the strangest ways people sabotage themselves, because it often happens while they think they are being responsible. They say, "I just want to be prepared." But preparation is not the same as mentally feeding the worst-case outcome until it feels inevitable. Real preparation supports action. Mental rehearsal of failure weakens action. It makes you smaller before the moment starts. It makes your body more rigid, your voice less steady, your thinking less creative, your response less clean. Then, because you are already entering from contraction, the result often becomes weaker than it had to be, and the mind says, "See, I knew it." But it did not know. It trained. That is the truth many people never face clearly enough. They are not only afraid of failure, they are privately devoted to it in imagination. They revisit it, they refine it, they replay it until it becomes more familiar than success, more believable than growth, more emotionally available than composure. Over time, the mind begins to feel more at home in defeat than in possibility, not because defeat is your nature, but because you've practiced it more often. And once you see that, the correction becomes obvious. You do not need to become delusional. You do not need to sit there imagining grand triumphs all day while doing nothing real. But you do need to stop making inner collapse your most repeated rehearsal. A stronger mind learns to practice something else. It practices steadiness. It practices follow-through. It practices seeing itself act with more control than fear expected. It practices holding pressure without instantly falling apart inside. It practices remembering, I may feel tension, but I can still show up cleanly. That kind of mental rehearsal changes the body too. Your breathing changes, your posture changes, your willingness changes. You start approaching hard things with less apology and less internal surrender, because your mind is no longer constantly introducing difficulty as a place where you are most likely to break. This is why your imagination must serve your life, not poison it. The mind will always project something forward. That is part of being human. The question is, what kind of projection you are feeding? Are you rehearsing disaster, or are you rehearsing composure? Are you mentally proving your old weakness, or are you strengthening your ability to act under pressure? Are you feeding the story that says, I will probably collapse again, or the pattern that says, I know how to return, adapt, and continue even if the moment is imperfect? That difference matters more than people think, because most important moments in life are entered twice, first in the mind, then in reality. If the mind keeps entering them with surrender, the body will follow. If the mind starts entering them with more steadiness, more discipline, and more grounded expectation, then the whole system begins responding differently. So be honest with yourself about what you keep rehearsing. Listen closely to the private films your mind plays when something meaningful is approaching. If the ending is always humiliation, loss, rejection, or self-betrayal, then you are not only facing life, you are feeding a script that makes self-belief harder than it needs to be. Change the script, not into fantasy, but into usefulness. Let your mind practice showing up. Let it practice staying with the moment. Let it practice one clean response instead of 10 imagined collapses. Let it practice finishing. Let it practice surviving discomfort without turning it into identity. Because mental training should support action, not replace it. It should leave you more available to life, not more frightened of it. And once you stop privately training yourself to fail, one of the deepest foundations of real self-belief becomes possible, because belief grows fastest when your actions begin proving that your promises to yourself mean something. 9. Build self-trust through daily discipline. One of the deepest reasons self-belief keeps collapsing in people's lives is that their inner promises and their actual behavior keep drifting apart. And once that gap becomes familiar, something quiet but destructive happens inside them. They stop taking themselves seriously. They say they will begin, then delay. They say they will stay consistent, then disappear for 3 days. They say they are changing, but their own nervous system keeps watching them abandon the small agreements that would have made that change believable. After enough repetition, belief does not disappear because they are weak. It disappears because their life keeps teaching them that their words to themselves do not hold much weight. That is why self-belief cannot survive on emotion alone. It needs evidence. And the most reliable form of evidence is daily discipline, not the dramatic kind, not the kind people perform loudly for a week and then quietly drop, but the kind that makes you trustworthy to yourself again. The alarm rings and you get up. The work is there and you begin. The difficult thing is still uncomfortable, but you stop negotiating with it for an hour before touching it. The mind says later, and you answer with now. These are not small victories. They are identity builders. They tell your system, I am not only someone who wants better. I am someone who can be counted on by myself. That changes everything. Because when discipline becomes daily, self-trust stops being abstract. It becomes something the body has felt. You do not have to keep talking yourself into confidence when your own life is already giving you proof. You have seen yourself act when you did not feel like it. You have seen yourself return after a bad day instead of turning one slip into a week of disappearance. You have seen yourself keep your word in small moments where no one was watching. And those moments matter more than grand speeches ever will, because the mind trusts repeated evidence far more than emotional declarations. This is where many people get trapped in the wrong approach. They try to build self-belief through inspiration, affirmation, or occasional intense effort. But if the daily structure keeps contradicting the identity they want, then the deeper system will never fully believe them. You can say, I am becoming stronger, all you want, but if your habits keep rehearsing avoidance, delay, self-betrayal, and inconsistency, your nervous system will believe the habits before it believes the words. Discipline is what closes that gap. It turns self-belief from something you hope to feel into something your actions keep confirming. And it does not need to begin with giant standards. In fact, giant standards often destroy self-trust when they are used badly, because they create promises your current structure cannot yet hold. Then, the mind watches you fail yourself again and becomes even less convinced. A wiser approach is cleaner and humbler. You start with what you can repeat, not what sounds impressive, what you can actually keep. A morning anchor, a fixed writing block, a daily walk, a clear bedtime. One honest promise kept every day until your system begins trusting your consistency more than your moods. That is how self-trust is rebuilt, not through intensity, but through reliability. And once reliability appears, self-belief becomes steadier. You stop needing to ask, "Can I really do this?" Because another part of you has already started answering, "I do difficult things every day." That answer does not come from fantasy. It comes from accumulated proof. Proof that you can start without perfect emotion. Proof that you can return after slipping. Proof that you can act without applause. Proof that the stronger version of you is not a dream anymore, but a pattern being practiced in real time. This also changes your relationship with hard days. A person without discipline often treats a bad day like the collapse of the whole identity, but a person who has built daily structure has somewhere to return. They do not have to reinvent themselves every morning. The path is already there. Even if the energy is lower, even if the emotions are heavier, even if the old self is louder that day, the structure still exists. And structure is one of the most merciful forms of strength because it holds you together when inspiration disappears. That is why discipline should never be understood as punishment. It is one of the purest forms of self-respect. It says, "I will not leave my future in the hands of whatever I happen to feel today." It says, "I am building something in myself that can survive mood, fear, distraction, and fluctuation." That is what makes belief durable, not because life becomes easier, but because your relationship with yourself becomes less fragile. So if you want stronger self-belief, stop asking only what you feel about yourself and start looking at what your days are teaching you about yourself. Are your habits making you easier to trust or harder? Are your routines giving your mind evidence of steadiness or evidence that your promises evaporate under pressure? Are you building an identity your own body can start relying on, or still living like each day has to renegotiate whether you mean what you say? Those questions matter because confidence built without self-trust eventually collapses. But self-trust built through repeated discipline becomes one of the strongest foundations a human being can stand on. It does not make you loud, it makes you solid. And when you become solid inside, setbacks stop feeling like proof that you are not enough. They become something else entirely, something you can learn from without turning it against yourself. 10. Refuse to let failure define you. There is a moment after failure that decides far more than the failure itself, and it usually happens quietly before anyone else knows what you are telling yourself about what just happened. The event is over. The mistake has already landed. The plan did not work. The effort did not pay off the way you hoped. And now the mind moves in fast, not only to describe what happened, but to decide what it means about you. That is the dangerous part, because failure by itself is painful but manageable. What destroys people is when they turn it into identity too quickly. One setback becomes, "I am not built for this." One rejection becomes, "I was foolish to believe in myself." One collapse in discipline becomes, "This is who I really am." And once failure becomes personal in that way, it stops being information and starts becoming a prison. That is why this point matters so much. You do not need a life with no setbacks in order to become unstoppable. You need a relationship with failure that does not let it rewrite your self-concept every time life gets hard. Most people are not broken by one bad result. They are broken by the story they attach to it. They fail once, then replay it until it becomes larger than the facts. They stop looking at the method and start attacking the self. They stop asking what needs to be corrected and start asking what is wrong with them. That shift is subtle, but it changes everything. Because once the mind starts treating failure like a verdict on your worth, your energy drops immediately. Your future attempts become weaker before they begin. Your body approaches the next challenge with less openness and more fear. Then, because you are now acting from injury instead of intelligence, the next result is often worse, and the mind takes that as even more proof that you should have never believed in yourself in the first place. This is how people bury their own potential, not through one failure, but through giving failure a level of authority it never deserved. The healthier response is harder on the ego, but far better for your life. You refuse to let failure answer the question of who you are. You let it answer a narrower question. What is this showing me? That question keeps you in movement. It keeps you in reality. It protects the self while still allowing the lesson to land. Because setbacks do matter. They may reveal weak preparation, poor timing, bad habits, unrealistic pacing, emotional impulsiveness, or lack of skill. But none of that means the failure has the right to define your identity. It only means reality gave you information, and mature people know how to use information without kneeling before it. This is why resilience matters more than emotional perfection. A strong life is not built by never falling apart for a moment. It is built by learning how quickly you can return without turning one difficult moment into a full psychological collapse. Recovery speed matters. The mind will still react. Disappointment will still hit. Shame may still knock. Frustration may still rise. But when you stop letting those reactions become your whole story, you shorten the distance back to yourself. You feel the blow, but you do not start living inside it. You take the lesson, but you do not hand it the keys. And that takes discipline, because part of the mind secretly prefers self-condemnation after failure. Condemnation feels intense, and intensity can feel like seriousness. It can feel as if you are really confronting the truth. But often, it is only wasted suffering. It does not improve your method. It does not sharpen your judgment. It only leaves you emotionally weaker for the next round. Real seriousness looks quieter. It says, "That did not work." Good. Now be honest enough to learn from it and strong enough not to become it. That is how failure becomes useful. You begin separating event from identity. "I failed here" is very different from "I am a failure." "This attempt was weak" is very different from "I am weak." "My current system did not hold" is very different from "I never hold anything together." Those distinctions may sound simple, but they protect self-belief at the exact moment it is most vulnerable. They allow correction without self-destruction. They let you stay teachable instead of collapsing into shame. And if you think about the people you respect most, this is usually part of what makes them strong. Not that they never lost, never stumbled, never misjudged, never had seasons of doubt, but that they learned how to take a hit without turning it into a permanent identity. They adjusted. They kept moving. They returned faster. They let failure shape skill, not self-hatred. That is the path in front of you too. So when failure comes, do not ask it the wrong question. Do not ask, "What does this prove about me?" Ask, "What does this demand from me now?" Better structure, better preparation, more patience, less ego, a different pace, more reps, more honesty? Those are useful questions. Those are questions that keep your power in your hands. Because failure is only final when you start protecting it as part of your identity. As long as it remains information, it can still serve you. As long as it remains a lesson, it can still strengthen you. As long as it does not become a definition, it cannot stop your life from expanding. So refuse the lazy cruelty of turning one bad result into a whole self-description. Refuse the old habit of letting disappointment narrate your identity. Refuse the temptation to make suffering sound deeper by making it more personal than it needs to be. Let failure adjust your method. Let it sharpen your standards. Let it expose what still needs work. But do not let it introduce you to yourself. Because the person you become is not decided by whether you ever fail. It is decided by whether failure teaches you or starts owning you. And once you learn how to stand back up without giving failure. The final word, one more thing becomes necessary because growth will keep collapsing if your standards stay low enough to protect the old self. 11. Raise your standards. Until the old, you cannot survive. A person does not leave an old identity behind just because they are tired of it. They leave it behind when life around them stops making it easy to continue. That is why standards matter so much, not as a performance, not as a way of looking superior, but as a form of pressure in the right direction. If your standards stay low enough to protect your old habits, your old environment, your old excuses, and your old way of speaking to yourself, then the weaker version of you will always find a way back in. It may disappear for a few days, maybe even a few weeks, but it will survive because the conditions that once fed it are still being preserved. This is what many people miss when they talk about growth. They think growth is mainly about wanting more, understanding more, or feeling ready for more. But growth also requires refusal. Refusal to keep living at the same level of disorder. Refusal to keep tolerating the same kind of mental laziness, the same draining relationships, the same weak routines, the same scattered environment, the same casual self-betrayal that kept the older self comfortable for years. Until that refusal becomes real, ambition stays emotional. It sounds strong, but it has no structure to stand in. That is why higher standards are not cosmetic. They are survival pressure for the new identity. If you keep tolerating mediocrity everywhere, your growth will keep collapsing back into the same familiar pattern. You say you want to become stronger, but your schedule is still chaotic. You say you want more self-respect, but you keep accepting the same low-quality behavior from people who pull you backward. You say you want a clearer mind, but your environment still feeds distraction, avoidance, and mental noise. Then the older version of you does what it has always done. It returns to what is easiest, because your standards never became strong enough to make the return uncomfortable. That is the real function of standards. They change what feels normal. Once that changes, the old self starts losing oxygen. It can still speak. It can still tempt. It can still try to pull you toward the old rhythm, but it no longer finds the same shelter. The room is different now. The pace is different. The people around you are different. The way you answer weakness is different. The things you tolerate in your body, your habits, your environment, and your relationships are different. And because those conditions have changed, the older identity has to fight much harder to survive. This is where standards become deeply practical. They show up in behavior first. You stop making casual promises you do not keep. You stop treating your sleep, your time, your attention, and your word like flexible things that can be sacrificed every time comfort asks for them. Then they show up in environment. You stop surrounding yourself with disorder and calling it normal. You clean the room. You structure the day. You reduce access to what weakens you. Then they show up in relationships. You stop normalizing disrespect, confusion, emotional chaos, and one-sided connection. You stop acting as if being familiar makes something healthy. You begin asking a harder question. Does this fit the person I am trying to become, or does it keep feeding the person I am trying to outgrow? That question becomes a filter, and filters change lives faster than motivation does, because filters decide what keeps entering, what behaviors keep repeating, what influences keep speaking, what habits keep surviving. The old self is rarely defeated by one dramatic breakthrough. It weakens when the systems around it stop protecting it, when lower habits stop being convenient, when self-disrespect stops being excused, when the little negotiations that kept you stuck stop sounding harmless. This also means standards must become visible, not symbolic. It is easy to admire a high standard in theory. It is much harder to live in a way that forces it to exist. A person can say they want confidence, but if they keep moving through life apologetically, keep delaying hard things, keep tolerating half-effort from themselves, then the standard has not become real yet. A person can say they want peace, but if they still feed the same noise, still keep the same draining access open, still let their environment shape them carelessly, then peace is not their standard yet. It is just their preference. A real standard costs you something. It may cost you comfort. It may cost you convenience. It may cost you certain relationships. It may cost you the old emotional rhythm that once felt familiar. But that cost is exactly why it works. Standards matter because they force a split between who you were and who you are willing to keep being. They stop letting every mood vote equally. They stop letting every weak impulse redesign the day. They make certain returns impossible without friction, and that friction is a gift. It protects what you are building. So if you want the stronger version of you to survive, stop asking only what you want to become. Ask what standards would make the older version of you increasingly incompatible with the life you are building. What would you have to stop tolerating? What would need to become cleaner, firmer, more ordered, more honest? What would have to leave? What would have to become non-negotiable? Because once standards rise high enough, the old self loses room. It loses excuses. It loses hiding places. It loses the comfort of being endlessly in process, without actually changing. And that is when real transformation starts becoming visible. Not because you are louder, but because the life around you now matches the growth inside you. Your surroundings stop fighting your future. Your habits stop protecting your weakness. Your relationships stop rewarding your confusion. The old self begins to starve because the ecosystem that fed it is no longer being maintained. That is what this point is really about. Not becoming harsh. Becoming aligned. Raising the quality of what you allow until the smaller version of you can no longer live as easily as it once did. That is how identity shifts become durable. That is how belief stops collapsing every time life gets difficult. And that is why this step matters so much before the final one. Because once the old self has fewer places to hide, something stronger begins to form inside you. 12. Become harder to shake from the inside. At a certain point, self-belief stops looking like hype, intensity, or visible confidence, and starts looking like something much quieter and much more serious. Stability. Not the kind of stability that comes from life becoming easy, but the kind that comes from knowing that difficulty no longer has the same power to scatter you from the inside. You still feel pressure. You still feel disappointment. You still feel fear, uncertainty, and friction. But those things stop moving through you like absolute authority. They stop deciding your identity every time they appear. That is what it means to become harder to shake from the inside. It means your center is no longer so easily rented by conditions. This is the deepest form of self-belief, because it is no longer based on performance. It is no longer dependent on whether the day feels good, whether people understand you, whether the plan unfolds neatly, or whether the result arrives on schedule. It becomes the quieter knowledge that you can handle pressure, adapt when things shift, absorb a difficult moment without turning it into collapse, and continue even when the emotional weather is not ideal. That kind of confidence is not dramatic enough for most people's imagination, but it is the kind that actually changes lives. A lot of people spend years chasing a louder version of confidence because it looks easier to recognize. They want to feel bold, certain, fearless, unstoppable in a visible way. But visible confidence can still be fragile. A person can look strong in good conditions and still fall apart the moment life stops cooperating. Real self-belief is tested elsewhere. It is tested when there is no applause, no immediate proof, no perfect mood, no external reassurance, and yet you still remain in motion. You still think clearly enough to return to your standards. You still refuse to let one hard moment define the whole day. You still remember who you are trying to become, even when your emotions are not helping you. That is the point where confidence stops being something you are trying to generate and becomes the way you move. You can feel the difference in small moments. Someone doubts you, and you do not immediately shrink. A plan changes, and you adjust without making the change a verdict on your future. You fail, and instead of building an identity out of the disappointment, you collect the lesson and keep the center. Fear rises, but it no longer gets automatic leadership. Other people's opinions still exist, but they stop entering you so deeply. The old self still speaks sometimes, but it no longer sounds like the final voice in the room. That is what becoming harder to shake looks like in real life. Not a constant emotional high, but a different kind of interior weight. And that weight matters because the world is never going to become stable enough to do this work for you. Conditions will keep changing. People will keep projecting. Timing will keep disappointing you sometimes. Some things will work late. Some things will hurt more than they should. Some seasons will feel heavy without warning. If your self-belief depends on the outside becoming easy, then it will remain temporary forever. But if it becomes internal structure, then difficulty may still hit you, but it will not own you so quickly. That is what all the previous work has really been building toward. You broke the story that kept you small. You started training confidence instead of waiting for it. You taught your mind to see more possibility. You moved before perfect certainty. You shifted from motivation to identity. You stopped treating fear like a final answer. You brought your standard inward instead of begging for approval. You stopped rehearsing failure, built self-trust through discipline, refused to let setbacks become definitions, and raised your standards until the older version of you had less room to survive. None of that was random. It was all strengthening your center. Now the result becomes visible from the inside out. You stop needing perfect conditions to begin. You stop needing constant reassurance to continue. You stop needing every outcome to confirm your worth. You stop needing every difficult emotion to disappear before you can act. That is when life starts feeling different, because the inner world is no longer built like a house with weak foundations. Pressure can still hit it, but it does not collapse as easily. You recover faster. You return faster. You trust yourself more under friction. And once that trust becomes real, the outer world starts feeling less threatening, not because the world changed, but because you did. This is also why being harder to shake is deeply connected to peace. Peace is not always softness. Sometimes peace is structure. Sometimes it is the steady refusal to let every problem become a crisis inside you. Sometimes it is the discipline of staying connected to your own standard when old fear wants to turn you back into someone more fragile. And there is real freedom in that, because once your interior world becomes less easy to disturb, you stop wasting so much of your life recovering from things that never should have owned you so completely in the first place. So let this be the deeper definition of unstoppable, not someone who never feels fear, not someone who never doubts, never fails, never gets tired, never has a hard season, but someone who has become sturdy enough inside that none of those things can permanently disconnect them from their direction. Someone who knows how to bend without becoming broken. Someone who can lose a moment without losing the self. Someone who can be tested by life without handing life the right to define them. That kind of person is hard to stop, not because they are loud, because they are rooted. And once you become rooted like that, self-belief is no longer something you chase every time you feel weak. It becomes a quieter fact, one built through repetition, structure, honesty, and the refusal to keep protecting the identity built by fear. Becoming unstoppable does not begin with one dramatic breakthrough. It begins when you stop protecting the self built by fear and start reinforcing a stronger one on purpose. You change the story, train the mind, move before certainty, face what intimidates you, stop asking for permission, stop rehearsing defeat, build self-trust through discipline, learn from failure without becoming it, and raise your standards until the old version of you has fewer and fewer places left to live. That is how self-belief becomes less emotional and more structural. It stops being a feeling you wait for and starts becoming a way of living. And once it becomes structural, it does not disappear every time life gets difficult. It stays with you in a steadier form, quieter, stronger, less dependent on mood, less dependent on praise, less dependent on everything outside you, finally becoming easy. So do not leave this episode inspired for a day and unchanged for a month. Take one principle from it and make it real now. Break one old story, keep one promise, face one fear, raise one standard. Let one part of the weaker identity lose its protection today. Because that is how a stronger self is built, not through fantasy, not through noise, but through repeated proof that you are no longer willing to live under the authority of fear. And once that proof begins to accumulate, belief stops being something you try to force for a moment and starts becoming the way you carry yourself through life.